She took the last seat because her feet hurt more than the stranger frightened her. Laurel Quinn had spent nearly 9 hours inside a federal courthouse. She drew other people's faces while lawyers argued over things the gallery wasn't allowed to interrupt. By the time she reached Grand Central, one late train had been cancelled and another delayed. Half of Lower Manhattan seemed to have decided to go north at the same time. The Metro North car was crowded enough that people stood in the aisle with bags pressed between their shoes. Laurel moved through it with a sketch case over one shoulder and a paper cup of coffee she no longer trusted. Only one seat remained. It was beside a man in a dark coat who occupied no more space than anyone else and somehow had twice as much emptiness around him. A scar ran from his left temple toward the line of his jaw, pale against darker skin. It wasn't dramatic enough to be theatrical, and it was too old to invite questions. People had looked at the seat, then elsewhere. She also noticed her calves burning. She sat. The stranger glanced at her once, not offended, not surprised, just aware. Then he returned to the paperback open in one hand. Laurel settled her case between her ankles and tried not to wonder why the nearest standing passenger had chosen to remain standing. The train pulled out beneath the city with its usual metallic complaint. For several minutes, nothing happened. A woman across the aisle scrolled through photographs. 2 college students whispered about an exam. Someone farther down the car argued quietly into a phone about a plumber. The scarred man turned a page. Laurel caught herself studying his hands, because hands were often more useful than faces. No rings. A faint burn mark near one thumb. Knuckles marked by old damage rather than anything recent. She looked away before observation became staring. Without lifting his eyes from the book, he said, "You draw people for a living." Laurel looked at her case. That obvious. He nodded toward the courthouse, badge still clipped to her coat. Courthouse badge. She had forgotten it was there. Less impressive deduction than I hoped. His mouth shifted almost imperceptibly. I didn't claim it was impressive. At the next stop, 3 men entered from the adjoining car. Laurel noticed them only because the first one stopped so abruptly that the man behind him nearly walked into his back. He was broad, middle-aged, wearing a construction jacket over a collared shirt. His eyes fixed on the stranger beside Laurel. Whatever he had been saying ended in the middle of a word. The second man followed his gaze and went still. The third looked toward the conductor, then toward the door, as if recalculating whether he had entered the wrong car. Silence did not fall all at once. It spread. The college students stopped whispering because the men stopped talking. The woman across the aisle looked up because the students had gone quiet. A man near the window removed one earbud because everyone else seemed to be listening to something he could not hear. The conductor stepped into the aisle, took in the posture of the 3 newcomers, and slowed. The first man swallowed. Mr. Varga. The stranger closed his book around one finger and looked up. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. "Sit down. You're blocking the aisle." The man's face tightened. "We weren't expecting, I know." Nothing in the answer sounded threatening. That made the reaction around them worse. One of the 3 men sat immediately. The other 2 followed. The conductor watched for another second, then moved on. Conversation did not resume at once. It returned in pieces after the train started moving again, lower than before. Laurel kept her face neutral while her pulse climbed. The man beside her opened his book as if nothing had happened. She waited until the nearest conversations had restarted before saying very quietly, "I'm guessing this seat was empty for a reason." His eyes remained on the page. "Several." Laurel looked at the aisle full of standing passengers. "Useful information 5 minutes ago." This time she saw the almost smile clearly. He turned another page. "Do you want to move?" Laurel surveyed the car. There was still nowhere to go. "Apparently the market has spoken." The train slowed unexpectedly about 10 minutes later and stopped between stations. A signal delay, the conductor announced. Approximately 15 minutes. Groans moved through the car, and the tension finally broke into the ordinary misery of commuters inconvenienced after midnight. Laurel set her bad coffee on the floor and opened the smaller notebook she kept in her bag. Drawing helped when waiting became irritating. She sketched the bent neck of the woman across the aisle, the profile of a student asleep against the window, and the broad construction worker several rows ahead. She didn't think much about why his face felt familiar. Her pencil moved quickly, catching angles before details. She flipped back through older pages looking for a clean sheet and exposed a courthouse study from 3 weeks earlier. It showed a narrow-faced man in his 50s seated behind counsel, one hand covering his mouth while a witness testified. The stranger beside her stopped turning pages. "Where did you see that man?" Laurel closed the notebook. He looked at her now with full attention. The effect was considerably more unsettling than the scar. "At work," she said. "What kind of work?" Laurel slipped one hand over the notebook cover, the kind where strangers don't get access to my notes. His gaze stayed on the closed notebook for a second before returning to her face. "His name is Leon Sayegh." Laurel studied him. That sounded less like a question. It wasn't. She put the notebook back inside her bag. "Then we're finished." He could have insisted. The 3 men who had gone silent at the sight of him suggested insistence was probably a skill he had. Instead, he reopened his book and said, "All right." That response made Laurel more curious, which annoyed her. The signal cleared sooner than announced. As the train picked up speed, she watched the dark windows reflect the car back at itself. The man beside her read without fidgeting, but she had spent too many years sketching defendants, witnesses, jurors, and attorneys. She could tell the difference between stillness and ease. He was not relaxed. He was waiting. The 3 construction men left 2 stops before Laurel's. None looked directly at him on the way out. One did, however, glance at Laurel with an expression she could not translate cleanly. Warning, perhaps pity, curiosity. She resisted the temptation to decide. That was the occupational hazard nobody mentioned. Spend enough time drawing people under pressure. You started to believe posture was confession. Laurel knew better in theory. In practice, she had already begun piecing together a story about the man beside her, the scar, his silence, frightened workers, a familiar name, Leon Sayegh. The pieces arranged themselves too easily. Her stop was called shortly after midnight. Laurel stood. She pulled her sketch case over one shoulder and stepped into the aisle. The stranger closed his book. "If Leon Sayegh contacts you, don't tell him," I asked. Laurel stared at him. "That is an extremely bad way to make something sound harmless." He met her eyes. "I didn't say it was harmless." "Better." The doors opened. She moved toward them, then looked back once. "Do I get a name? Or is the terrified construction crew supposed to cover introductions?" He held her gaze. "Marek Varga." Laurel repeated it once in her head, committing the sound to memory. "Good night, Mr. Varga. Good night, Ms. Quinn." She stopped. "I didn't tell you my name." He nodded toward the courthouse badge still clipped to her coat. Laurel looked down, irritated with herself for the second time that night. Marek's expression did not change. Still not an impressive deduction. The platform air was cold enough to wake her completely. Laurel walked toward the exit with the sense that somebody might be behind her. Checked once, and found nobody. No black car idled at the curb. No guard appeared. Marek Varga remained on the train as it pulled away. By the time Laurel reached home, curiosity had beaten caution by a narrow margin. She fed her cat. She removed her courthouse badge and opened her laptop at the kitchen table. She typed Marek Varga into the search bar. The first photograph was old enough that the scar looked newer and angrier. The headline beneath it mentioned organized crime, freight companies, and a federal investigation that had never produced the charges prosecutors publicly expected. Another article described the Varga syndicate as a network built around construction, logistics, nightlife, and intimidation. Laurel clicked again. 6 years earlier, a warehouse on the industrial edge of Queens had burned through the night. 4 people died. Investigators initially blamed an electrical failure. Evidence of sabotage changed the case. Marek Varga had been pulled from the building alive with severe burns. Laurel stared at the photograph longer than she meant to. Then she saw another name in the article. Leon Sayeg, former Varga accountant, cooperative witness, questioned in connection with financial records after the fire. She leaned back from the screen. The scarred stranger on the train had not asked where she lived. He had not demanded the notebook. He had not threatened Leon. Those facts mattered. So did the silence of 3 men who had gone pale at the sight of him. Laurel opened another article and found a photograph of Marek entering court years earlier, surrounded by cameras. In the picture, everyone seemed to know exactly what kind of man he was. She closed the laptop. Laurel had spent her career drawing faces, while other people argued about what those faces meant. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, she was not sure whether she had seen too little or already decided too much. Laurel spent the next morning doing exactly what she told herself she was not doing. She was not investigating Marek Varga. She was reading public records about a man who had unexpectedly recognized someone in her sketchbook, which felt different only if you let language do the work of law. She stayed within the obvious boundaries, archived news reports, federal docket summaries available to the public, old business profiles, and photographs from hearings she might already have covered without remembering. The warehouse fire appeared everywhere once she knew where to look. 6 years earlier, a Varga-controlled freight property in Queens had burned after midnight. 4 workers died. Marek survived with burns along the left side of his face and neck. Initial reporting blamed an electrical fault, then shifted toward deliberate sabotage when investigators found evidence of tampered suppression equipment and unauthorized inventory. Charges moved in several directions and then seemed to dissolve into separate cases. One article mentioned Leon Sayeg as a former accountant who had cooperated with federal investigators. Another described him only as a financial witness. Laurel found no clean explanation for why a man associated with the Varga organization would want to know where Leon had been seen. That did not stop her from inventing several explanations. By Monday, Laurel was back at the federal courthouse, drawing a sentencing hearing unrelated to any of it. The assignment was tedious enough that she became grateful for the discipline of looking at people who had nothing to do with Marek. Her job required attention without conclusion. A defendant rubbing his thumb over one knuckle could be nervous, bored, angry, cold, or simply aware of his own hand. A prosecutor leaning toward counsel might be whispering strategy or asking where lunch had been ordered. The drawing could preserve the posture. It could not claim the motive. Laurel knew that. She had built a career around knowing it. Yet Marek had already become a collection of interpreted details in her head, the men who went quiet, the scar, the old articles, his refusal to take her notebook, the warning about Leon. By lunch, she was irritated with herself enough to leave the courthouse and cross into the public cafe connected to the next building. She ordered soup, found a corner table, and opened her sketchbook, only after checking that Leon's portrait was several pages away. Marek Varga walked in 7 minutes later with a lawyer. Laurel stared at him, then at the courthouse entrance, visible through the glass wall. She immediately rejected coincidence as an explanation. He had a folder under one arm and his lawyer carried 2 more. Both wore the exhausted expressions of people who had spent the morning discussing documents. Marek noticed her before she decided whether to look away. He said something to the lawyer, who continued toward the counter. Then he came to Laurel's table without sitting. Ms. Quinn. Laurel closed the sketchbook. Mr. Varga, are you following courtroom artists now? Or should I feel less important? I have a meeting upstairs. He nodded toward the federal offices. Subpoena compliance. Old company records. She looked at the folders. That is disappointingly plausible. You seem disappointed. I had already prepared to be offended. Marek glanced at the empty chair opposite her. May I? Laurel gestured toward it. Public cafe. I apparently have very little control over seating arrangements around you. He sat. Up close. Daylight changed the scar without making it more dramatic. Laurel had expected the hard fluorescent lighting to make him look more dangerous. Instead, it made him look tired. She disliked that observation because it encouraged sympathy before evidence. I looked you up, she said. Marek's expression barely moved. I assumed you would. You could have mentioned the dead people. His gaze stayed on hers. Would it have changed where you sat? Laurel thought back to the packed train. Her aching feet. The empty seat. Probably not. Then, what would it have changed? What I thought the silence meant. That answer seemed to interest him. Marek leaned back slightly. Good. Laurel frowned. Good. You should change your mind when you learn more. You say that like a man who expects me to learn something favorable. I don't. That was not the answer she expected. She resented him slightly for depriving her of the easier version of the conversation. 4 people died, she said. Marek's gaze lowered to the table for a moment. Yes, you owned the warehouse. A holding company I controlled owned it. That sounds lawyer-shaped. It is still true. Laurel watched him carefully. And Leon Sayeg. His face became less readable. She tried not to overvalue that as information. He handled internal accounts for several Varga companies, then became a federal witness. For a period. You asked where I had seen him. Marek nodded once. I did. Why? He did not answer immediately. His lawyer returned with coffee. Saw Laurel. And stopped. Marek said, 10 minutes. Without looking away from her. The lawyer gave Laurel a brief, professional nod and chose another table. Marek then said, because Leon has information connected to the fire and the accounts that followed it. Laurel waited. And I have been trying to speak with him. That sounds worse every time you add detail. Marek's mouth shifted faintly. I know. Laurel folded her hands over the closed sketchbook. Do federal prosecutors know you're trying to speak with a former witness? My counsel knows. Their counsel knows I have requested contact through legal channels. That is considerably less cinematic than the train version. You were the one drawing conclusions. The sentence irritated her because it was accurate. She ignored that. Why not just subpoena him? I don't have subpoena power. Conveniently reassuring. Marek looked toward the window, then back at her. I asked about him because you had drawn him recently. That suggested he was appearing somewhere publicly after months of avoiding direct contact. Laurel's shoulders tightened. You thought I could tell you where. For approximately 3 seconds. And then you closed the notebook. Good memory. You made the boundary clear. There was no compliment in the words. That made them easier to believe. Laurel pushed at her lukewarm soup and said, I'm still not giving you the sketch. I didn't ask. You were going to. Possibly. That counts. Marek accepted the correction. The conversation should have ended there. But Laurel found herself asking, Did you know the building was unsafe? His expression changed so subtly that someone less trained might have missed it. Not guilt exactly. Recognition. That is not a question I'm answering in a cafe. Laurel felt the first real chill since the train, because the answer is privileged, Because the answer is longer than the version you want. You don't know what version I want. You spent an hour reading public records and came here with a theory. Laurel stiffened. I came here for soup. Merrick glanced at the untouched bowl. Poorly. She almost laughed, but was too annoyed to. You think everyone does this, don't you? She said. Does what builds a version of you before speaking to you? Marek looked at her for a long moment. Usually before entering the room, there was no self-pity in the answer. That made it worse. Laurel looked down at the scar she had promised herself not to interpret. She realized she already had. Survivor. Criminal. Penitent. Monster. Misunderstood man. Every version was cleaner than a human being. Maybe the articles are wrong, she said. Marek's expression hardened slightly. Maybe they are right about parts you haven't found yet. Laurel met his eyes. That almost sounded like a warning. It wasn't. What was it? Accuracy. His lawyer returned a few minutes later and said they were due upstairs. Marek stood, gathered his folder, and paused beside the table. Keep the sketch. Laurel looked up. I was planning to. If Leon contacts you, you should tell your editor or courthouse coordinator before agreeing to meet him privately. Her face cooled. There it is. What, you telling me what to do? Marek shook his head. No, I'm telling you, Leon is frightened, unpredictable, and connected to an old federal matter. What you do with that is your decision. Laurel studied him, suspicious of how deliberately the distinction had been made. You rehearse that? No. Pity. It sounded almost responsible. He left with the lawyer before she could decide whether she had been joking. Laurel spent the afternoon drawing a defendant whose sentencing had been delayed twice and thinking about a man who had refused both innocence and explanation. That was the part she could not place. People under scrutiny usually tried to correct the image. They added context, softened language, blamed timing, emphasized what others had done. Marek had done none of that. He had also refused the simplest version of self-condemnation. He did not say the articles were lies. He did not say the dead workers had nothing to do with him. He only said the answer was longer. Laurel hated how much that made her want to hear it. Near 5. She packed her pencils, slid the sketches into a portfolio sleeve, and left through the side entrance used by credentialed artists and press. The plaza outside had thinned in the cold. She was halfway toward the subway when someone said her name. Laurel Quinn. She stopped. The man approaching was thinner than in her sketch, with more gray at his temples. His coat was buttoned badly over a wrinkled shirt. She recognized him before he gave his name. Leon Sayeg. Laurel's hand tightened around the strap of her case. We've never met. Leon glanced toward the courthouse doors, then toward the street behind her. No, but you drew me. His voice was quiet and strained. At the Halpern hearing, 3 weeks ago. Laurel remembered now. He had sat behind counsel for less than 20 minutes. He left before testimony ended. How did you know who I was? She asked. Your name was on the press credential list. That answer was plausible enough to make her uneasy. Leon stepped closer, though not enough to crowd her. I need to ask you something. Laurel thought of Marek's warning. She resented that she heard it in his voice. Ask. Leon looked directly at her. Have you spoken to Marek Varga? For several seconds. Laurel said nothing. The city moved around them in ordinary afternoon noise horns. Footsteps. A delivery truck reversing somewhere down the block. She had spent the last 3 days wondering why Marek wanted Leon. Now, Leon had found her first. And whatever existed between the two men was no longer something Laurel could pretend belonged entirely inside old newspaper archives. Leon Sayeg did not answer Laurel's question about Marek on the courthouse plaza. He looked past her toward the street. then asked whether they could move somewhere warmer. Laurel said no to anywhere private, and yes to the coffee kiosk inside the public atrium, where security cameras covered every entrance and half the tables were occupied by lawyers who had forgotten how to leave work. Leon accepted the condition without argument. That made him seem less dangerous and more frightened. Laurel knew that wasn't the same thing as safe. He bought tea he barely touched. He sat across from her with both hands around the paper cup. He asked about me, Laurel said. Leon's eyes closed briefly. On the train, she nodded. He saw a sketch. Leon looked almost relieved by the explanation. Then he doesn't know where I've been. Laurel did not answer. I'm not helping either of you find the other, she said. Good. Leon's voice tightened. Don't. The answer was so immediate that Laurel leaned back. You approached me because I needed to know whether he had already reached you. Reached me sounds dramatic. Merrick has always been good at making drama look like logistics. Leon did not tell her everything. He had spent years working in accounting for companies connected to Varga freight operations. He started as a junior controller and later became the person who knew which numbers were supposed to look ordinary. The warehouse that burned had been one of several properties used for legitimate freight and illegal inventory at the same time. Fire inspections had found electrical faults, blocked exits, and a suppression system that required immediate repair. Was Marek told? Laurel asked. Leon looked down at his tea. Yes. The answer landed harder because he did not soften it. How long before the fire? Long enough. That is not a number. Leon rubbed one thumb along the cup seam. At least several days before the final inspection report. Maybe more, depending on which warning you count. Laurel felt the version of Marek she had been quietly constructing change beneath her. The man on the train who had not threatened anyone. The man in the cafe who had refused to call himself innocent. She had treated those details as evidence pointing in one direction. Leon continued. He wanted the warehouse cleared. He also wanted time to move inventory without exposing what was stored there. There was pressure from Pavel Orlov and others to keep operations running. Marek delayed the shutdown, Laurel asked. And then somebody sabotaged it. Leon nodded. That is what the evidence eventually showed. Did Marek order that? No. Leon looked at her sharply. I never saw evidence he ordered the fire, but he knew the building was unsafe. Yes. Laurel left the atrium with that answer, following her all the way back upstairs. She spent the rest of the afternoon drawing a witness whose testimony she barely heard because one sentence kept repeating underneath everything else. He knew. The strange part was not that Marek had done something wrong. She had read enough about the Varga organization to know innocence would have been the more absurd conclusion. What disturbed her was how quickly she had started rewarding him for not matching the ugliest version of his reputation. He had not taken her notebook. Therefore restraint. He had not lied about the dead workers. Therefore, honesty. He had warned her about Leon without forcing her. Therefore, responsibility. Laurel knew better than to confuse isolated observations with character. Yet, she had begun doing exactly that. By 5:30, she was angry enough with herself to send Marek a message. She used the public number listed for his attorney's office. She gave her name and wrote only, I have a question about the warehouse. If you want to answer it, call me. She expected nothing that evening. Marek called 23 minutes later. They met the next day in the lobby bar of a hotel across from Bryant Park. It was public enough that Laurel did not have to wonder what message she was sending by arriving. Marek was already there with coffee and no visible escort. He stood when she approached, then waited for her to choose the table. Laurel sat opposite him and skipped greeting. You knew the warehouse was unsafe. Marek did not ask who told her. Yes. How unsafe? Unsafe enough that it should have been shut down. The directness made her angrier. And you kept it open. For 48 hours longer than I should have. Laurel stared at him. Why Marek looked toward the window before answering. There was inventory inside that would have exposed several illegal operations if inspectors found it. Moving it quickly would have cost money, compromised routes, and created records I did not want created. So 4 people died because you were protecting business. His jaw tightened. 4 people died because Pavel Orlov arranged sabotage at a building I had already failed to close. Laurel heard the distinction and hated that it mattered. That is a very precise sentence. It has had 6 years to become precise. She expected him to add something that softened the guilt. He did not. Marek said, "The fire was not supposed to happen. That does not make the delay harmless. I knew enough to close the building, and I did not." Laurel leaned back. She looked at the scar she had once tried to read as evidence of suffering and almost as evidence of penance. "So they were wrong about you," she said. Marek's eyes held hers. Not enough. The answer removed the last clean version available to her. He was not the monster implied by every rumor, and he was not the misunderstood man her own imagination had begun rescuing. He was someone who had made an unforgivable calculation before another man committed a worse act. Laurel looked down at the table. "I think I wanted the story to be simpler. Most people do. You let them think the worst. Sometimes the worst was useful." She looked up. Marek's expression remained still. "People who fear you negotiate differently. Men who think you might be responsible for things you did not do often avoid testing what you will do. So, the reputation protected you. Yes. And let you avoid correcting anything. Also yes." That admission changed the conversation more than an apology would have. Laurel asked what he wanted from Leon. Marek said there was a ledger created after the fire. It was not a handwritten criminal diary, but a set of duplicate accounting records showing money siphoned through subcontractors and shell vendors. Leon had preserved copies before leaving the organization. According to Marek, the records could show that Pavel Orlov had continued moving money through companies tied to the warehouse and had paid subcontractors, who later appeared in the sabotage investigation. "You want the ledger to clear your name," Laurel said. "Partly. At least you're consistent." Marek's mouth flattened. "It would show I did not order the fire. It would also show why the building remained open." Laurel watched him. "Meaning, your own negligence becomes harder to hide." "Yes." "Then why not let Leon give it directly to prosecutors?" Marek was quiet for a moment. "Because I wanted to know what was in it before everyone else did." Laurel almost smiled. But there was nothing amusing about the answer. "There it is." "What?" "You still want the truth arranged before it becomes public." Marek did not argue. "I prefer knowing what is coming. That is not the same as being entitled to control it." "No," he said the word without defensiveness, which prevented Laurel from turning the exchange into another lesson he could pass. Leon's next contact did not come through Laurel. It came through his attorney. She learned that only because Marek told her 2 days later, when they happened to speak by phone. Leon had agreed to meet federal counsel in a conference room with his own lawyer present. Marek's counsel would attend separately because several Varga entities were already responding to subpoenas connected to old financial records. Laurel did not ask where or when. She was not part of the evidence chain, and she wanted to keep it that way. Instead, she returned to work and tried to draw what was actually in front of her. The discipline felt newly difficult. Every face invited a conclusion. Every posture suggested narrative. She caught herself assigning motives and forced herself back to line and proportion and gesture. Later that evening, she drew Marek from memory and hated the result. She had made the scar too dark and the eyes too tired. Both choices explained him. Neither was honest. The scheduled meeting with Leon never happened, but not because anyone took him. His attorney called federal counsel less than an hour beforehand and cancelled. No emergency was given. No alternate date was offered. Marek's lawyer informed him, while Laurel was sitting across from Marek at a small restaurant near the courthouse. They had agreed to meet after she finished an assignment because the conversation about the warehouse still felt unfinished. Marek read the message once and set the phone face down. Laurel watched his expression. What happened? Leon withdrew from the meeting. Meaning. His attorney cancelled. Do you know why? No. The old Marek might have treated uncertainty as an instruction to deploy people, call favors, and make the answer arrive. Laurel saw the impulse anyway in the stillness of his shoulders. What are you going to do? She asked. Marek looked at the phone, then at Hare. Nothing tonight. Laurel raised an eyebrow. That sounds painful. It is. He picked up his coffee instead of the phone. His attorney knows how to reach mine. Federal counsel knows he cancelled. If Leon wants another meeting, he can request one. Laurel studied him. And if he doesn't? Marek's expression became colder, though not at her. Then I live with not knowing why. The answer surprised them both. Outside, traffic moved through wet streets, headlights breaking across the restaurant windows. Laurel realized she had spent the last week trying to determine which version of Marek Varga was true. He was the man everyone feared, the man who had survived the fire, the man who had failed to close the warehouse, the man trying to expose Pavel, and the man who still wanted to control the timing of truth. None of those versions canceled the others. That was the part she had resisted. Marek glanced at the sketchbook beside her plate. Are you drawing me again? Laurel looked down. She had opened it without noticing and made only 3 lines that caught the angle of his shoulder. One hand around the coffee cup, and the outline of his scar left deliberately unfinished. Maybe. Which version? He asked. Laurel closed the notebook. I don't know yet. For once, the uncertainty did not feel like failure. Leon did not vanish. By noon the next day, his attorney had given federal counsel a reason for canceling, though not one anyone could turn into a dramatic headline. Leon had panicked. He had gone to his adult daughter's house in New Jersey, turned off his phone, and refused to speak to anyone connected to the old case for almost 18 hours. His lawyer knew where he was and had spent most of the night convincing him that avoiding the meeting would not make the ledger go away. Laurel learned none of this through Marek's people because he had not sent any of them. His attorney told him during a scheduled call, and Marek told Laurel later only because she asked whether Leon was safe. As far as anyone knows, he said. They were standing outside the courthouse beneath a gray afternoon sky. Laurel, carrying a portfolio under one arm. And what happens now? She asked. Marek looked toward the federal building. His attorney requested another meeting. Federal counsel agreed. Laurel waited. And you? My lawyer will attend. You, only if Leon agrees. That answer mattered more than Marek seemed to realize. Laurel had spent days expecting him to fall back into the version of himself. Everyone feared the moment uncertainty became inconvenient. Instead, he was allowing a frightened accountant to determine whether the room contained him. Leon agreed under conditions. Federal counsel present. His attorney beside him. Marek's attorney across the table. No Varga associates. No private meeting before or after. No conversation in hallways. Marek accepted all of it. When Leon added that he would allow Marek into the room only if every word could be treated as part of the formal discussion, Marek accepted that too. Laurel was not there. She was drawing an unrelated civil trial 3 floors away and had no legitimate role in the evidence process. That separation had become important to her. Curiosity did not create jurisdiction. She knew only what later became public through filings and what Marek chose to tell her directly. The conference lasted nearly 4 hours. Leon arrived carrying no dramatic leather ledger. He brought an encrypted drive, printed transaction summaries, and copies of accounting records preserved through his attorney. The records traced payments from Varga-linked freight companies into subcontractors controlled by Pavel Orlov, then into vendors that had appeared around the warehouse in the weeks before the fire. They supported the theory that Orlov had arranged sabotage through intermediaries. They also showed exactly why Marek had delayed closing the building. Illegal inventory, revenue exposure. They faced a 48-hour decision. Shutting down immediately would have cost millions and revealed operations federal investigators had not yet discovered. Marek could have let the documents speak for themselves. They already gave him something valuable evidence he had not ordered the fire. His attorney later told him that remaining silent about the safety decision might still be defensible, depending on how prosecutors interpreted the older inspection records. Instead, when federal counsel asked whether he had personally received notice of the violations before the fire, Marek answered yes. His lawyer turned toward him. Leon looked up. The prosecutor asked when. Marek gave the date. And after receiving that notice, did you authorize continued operation of the property? There were several ways to answer. He could distinguish legal ownership from daily management. He could emphasize Orlov's pressure, the incomplete inspection process, or the sabotage nobody expected. All were true enough to occupy hours. Marek said, yes, for 48 hours. His lawyer went very still. The prosecutor asked why. Marek looked at the transaction summaries on the table and said, because closing immediately would have exposed inventory I wanted moved first. Leon's expression changed. For years, the accountant had expected Marek to seek the ledger because it could narrow his guilt. Instead, Marek had just widened it himself. The federal attorney asked, did you know a fire would occur? Marek said no. Did you authorize sabotage? No. Did you understand that continued operation exposed employees to documented safety risks? Marek paused, not because he did not know the answer, but because his reputation had never required him to say it. Fear had always given him shortcuts. If everyone assumed the worst, he never had to choose which parts were actually his. Yes, he said. His attorney quietly asked for a break. Marek refused it. Put that in too. The prosecutor looked at him. Mr. Varga, counsel may want to advise you before you continue. He has. Marek's lawyer closed his eyes briefly. Leon stared across the table. Marek continued. Pavel Orlov arranged something I did not order. That does not erase the decision I did make. It was not confession as theater. No one in the room forgave him. Federal counsel simply continued asking questions. The consequences began before the week ended. Regulators reopened parts of the safety record. Several Serrano-style solutions would have been available to another man with Marek's resources. He could have quietly restructured assets, swapped board members, pushed partners into silence, or treated cooperation as a bargaining chip before a single, truthful sentence left the room. Marek's lawyers did negotiate. Because competent lawyers did not stop being lawyers, simply because their client had developed a conscience. But Marek refused to make complete immunity a condition of cooperation. That did not guarantee prison, nor did it guarantee freedom. It guaranteed uncertainty. Civil penalties became likely. Certain licenses could be challenged. 2 legitimate Varga companies began preparing for board changes. Lenders did not enjoy discovering their controlling figure had reopened his own regulatory history. Pavel Orlov's position worsened for different reasons. The ledger tied his subcontractors to money movements investigators had never fully explained. Federal prosecutors began seeking warrants for financial records across several of his construction companies. No one had been arrested by Friday. No empire collapsed overnight. The truth moved at the speed. Truth usually moved once lawyers got involved, document by document. Laurel saw Marek 2 evenings later at the same cafe where she had first confronted him about the dead workers. He looked unchanged. When she sat down, she noticed he had not touched the coffee in front of him. I heard the filings expanded, she said. Public docket notices had already shown that much. They did. Your attorney must love you. He has used the phrase, catastrophically cooperative. Laurel almost smiled. Then, she studied him. Why did you tell them more than they asked for? Marek's gaze settled on her. They asked whether I knew. You could have answered narrowly. I have done that for most of my life. He looked toward the window. There was always a version that made me harder to prosecute. Harder to question. Harder to pin down. Eventually, I stopped knowing whether silence protected the organization or simply protected me from saying what I had done. Laurel felt an old reflex rise. She wanted to interpret the confession for him, decide whether it meant remorse, transformation, redemption. She caught herself. Are you trying to become a better man? She asked instead. Marek looked almost irritated by the question. I don't know. Laurel nodded. Good answer. You expected one. I was trying very hard not to supply it. That night, Laurel went home and opened the sketch she had been working on for days. Marek's face occupied most of the page. She had drawn the scar accurately enough, but everything around it was wrong. The eyes were too shadowed, the mouth too severe. She had made the entire portrait explain itself, as though every line needed to testify. She stared at it for several minutes, then tore the sheet down the middle, not because Marek did not deserve to be drawn, because the drawing had become an argument rather than an observation. She started again on clean paper. This time, she drew only what she remembered from the cafe, one hand near an untouched cup. Shoulders held too still. The scar, no darker than the rest of his face. She left parts unfinished rather than inventing what belonged there. For a courtroom artist, that felt almost irresponsible. For Laurel, it felt honest. Leon's cooperation became formal the following week. His attorney delivered the complete records, and federal counsel verified the chain of custody. Investigators began comparing the ledger against archived bank transfers and subcontractor invoices. Orlov's lawyers issued predictable denials. Marek's business partners issued carefully worded statements about ongoing review. None of it provided the emotional clarity Laurel once would have wanted. Marek was still the man whose name made a train car go silent. He was also the man who had deliberately placed damaging facts about himself into a room where every word could cost him something. Neither fact cancelled the other. When Laurel saw him again outside the courthouse several days later, he noticed the sketchbook beneath her arm. You destroyed it, he said. Laurel stopped. How do you know your face when you looked at the old one? That is an annoyingly observational answer. I have been learning from a professional. She opened the book and showed him the new portrait. Marek studied the page without touching it. The scar was there. So was the tired line beside his mouth. The angle of his shoulder, the hand resting near the cup. Nothing in the drawing asked the viewer to pity him or fear him. Which version is that, he asked. Laurel looked at the unfinished edge of his coat, then at him. Months of habit urged her to answer with something elegant. Guilty man, survivor, criminal, witness, man trying to change. Instead, she said, I don't know yet. Marek's gaze lifted to hers. Laurel closed the sketchbook. And I'm starting to think that's not my failure. For once, he had nothing to add. The federal case would continue. Pavel Orlov had not yet been indicted. Marek did not know which licenses he would lose or whether prosecutors would pursue charges connected to the warehouse decision. He did not know how much of the Varga organization would survive once financial records stopped being protected by silence. Laurel did not know whether accepting consequences made him better or simply more honest than he had been before. She was learning not to finish that answer without him. Marek had spent years letting fear and rumor write the story in advance. He had finally done something far more dangerous than frightening a room into silence. He had put the truth into it. 5 months later, Marek Varga still had not been sentenced, cleared, redeemed, or transformed into anything convenient enough for a headline. The federal investigation had expanded into a web of old freight contracts, subcontractor payments, fire safety records, and financial transfers. These probes kept several teams of lawyers employed at rates Laurel refused to calculate. Pavel Orlov had finally been indicted on conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction-related counts after investigators tied his companies to payments surrounding the warehouse sabotage. An indictment was not a conviction, and Marek's own exposure remained separate. 2 Varga-controlled properties had been sold. He had stepped away from day-to-day authority at 3 legitimate companies while independent boards reviewed old records. Civil penalties were likely. Regulatory proceedings continued. His attorneys still argued over which decisions were criminal, which were negligent, and which belonged to men who had spent years benefiting from confusion. None of it made Marek innocent. None of it made every rumor true either. Laurel had learned to live with that unfinished sentence. She saw him when they both wanted to see each other. Sometimes for dinner. Sometimes for an hour of coffee between court assignments and legal meetings. They had not defined the relationship because neither seemed interested in turning uncertainty into another form of control. Marek never asked her to defend him. Laurel stopped, trying to decide whether every good thing he did represented change or simply another fact. Her gallery opening took place on a wet Thursday night in Chelsea. The series was called Public Record, though only 3 pieces involved courtrooms directly. Laurel had spent months drawing people caught between the way they were seen and the way they occupied physical space when nobody was explaining them. They included a retired judge on a subway platform, a woman leaving divorce court with half her face hidden by an umbrella, a famous defense attorney asleep in a hospital waiting room, strangers on buses, witnesses before testimony, and men whose expensive suits failed to make them look certain. Marek appeared in only one finished drawing. He sat at a cafe table with an untouched cup near his hand. His scar was visible and ordinary. His expression refused to be reduced to either repentance or menace. The label beside the work did not contain his name. It read simply, "Man waiting for an answer." Marek stood in front of it for nearly 2 minutes before Laurel approached. "You hate it," she said. "No, you've been staring long enough to develop objections." He looked at the label. "I don't remember waiting for an answer." Laurel moved beside him. "You were, from whom I didn't know when I drew it." Marek glanced at her. "And now," she smiled slightly, "I'm trying not to answer questions for people anymore." The opening ran late. Marek stayed without behaving as if his presence entitled him to Laurel's time. He melted into the crowd whenever collectors, former colleagues, or 2 courtroom reporters wanted her attention. People recognized him. Som staret. One man changed direction rather than pass too close. A woman near the wine table whispered his name to her husband. Marek noticed all of it and reacted to none of it. Months earlier, Laurel might have studied his stillness and decided whether it represented pain, arrogance, discipline, or resignation. Now she simply saw that he remained near the back wall until she was free. Shortly after 10:30, the gallery director began turning down lights. Laurel found Marek near the entrance holding her coat. "You know that is suspiciously helpful behavior," she said. "I can put it back." "Too late. Your reputation is collapsing." Marek helped her into the coat without comment. Outside, rain had softened into mist. Laurel looked toward the avenue. "Car?" he asked. She shook her head. "Train." His expression shifted. "You're going north tonight. My sister borrowed my apartment for a week. I'm staying at my mother's place, near Tarrytown." Marek nodded. "I'm going farther." Laurel glanced at him. "Then congratulations." We have invented public transportation together. They walked to the subway, transferred downtown, and reached Grand Central. They had 11 minutes before departure. The choice was deliberate enough that Laurel noticed the difference before they even found the platform. The first night, she had sat beside Marek because the universe had offered one available seat, and aching feet had defeated caution. Tonight, they bought tickets separately and walked through the terminal together. They boarded the same late train because neither of them had suggested doing otherwise. The car was crowded, though not as badly as before. People talked on phones and argued about luggage. Others laughed too loudly after drinks and negotiated with children who should have been asleep hours ago. Marek drew a few looks when he entered. 2 passengers recognized him openly. One nudged the other. Nobody stopped speaking. Nobody stood frozen in the aisle. The sound of the carriage continued around him. He had finally become one fact among many instead of the event that defined the room. There was one empty seat. Laurel saw it first and sat. Marek remained standing beside her. She looked up. There's room. Barely. Laurel shifted toward the window. You survived worse. Marek looked at the narrow space. Then at her. I remember the last time you said something like that. The last time I had no idea who you were. That did not stop you. I was tired. So the foundation of our relationship is poor transit planning. Laurel smiled. You're assuming there is a relationship. Marek sat beside her. That sounded like a question disguised as an insult. Careful. You're learning. The train pulled out of Grand Central. Laurel watched tunnel lights slide across the window until darkness replaced them. Marek sat close enough that the sleeve of his coat touched hers when the car turned. Neither moved away. For several stops, they talked about the gallery, not the federal case. Marek disliked one portrait because he thought the subject looked dishonest. Laurel asked whether he had spoken to the subject. He had not. Then you're doing my old job badly, she said. He accepted the criticism. Eventually the conversation quieted, and Laurel found herself looking at the scar. She had drawn it so often she knew its shape better than many faces she had been paid to capture. She also knew almost nothing about the moment it became part of him, only what public reports had said. Months earlier, she would have completed the missing scene herself. Smoke, guilt, rescue, punishment. This time she stopped. I have a question, she said. Marek turned toward her. And I'm trying very hard not to answer it for you. That sounds painful. You have no idea. Laurel folded her hands in her lap. When you look at the scar, what do you think about? Marek's expression changed, but Laurel did not name the change. He looked toward the window. Sometimes the fire. He paused. Sometimes nothing. Sometimes shaving. Laurel waited. Marek continued. For a long time I thought it was useful because people saw it before they saw me. They decided what happened. They decided what I had done. That made certain conversations easier. Because you didn't have to correct them. Yes. His fingers rested loosely against his knee. Later I hated it because it made the fire impossible to leave in the past. Laurel asked. And now, Marek looked at her. Now it is part of my face. The simplicity of the answer made her laugh softly. That is extremely inconvenient. Why I spent months trying to figure out what it meant. Did you? No. She shook her head. Eventually I figured out it was just part of your face. Marek watched her for a moment. You have stopped drawing conclusions. No. I still do it constantly. That is reassuring. I've started noticing when I do it. Laurel looked toward the carriage around them. There's a difference. She let the train noise fill the pause before saying, I thought you were dangerous that first night. I was. Say, that answer is annoying. You prefer inaccurate ones. No. I prefer answers that make conversation easier. Marek's mouth moved faintly. Laurel continued. Then I thought, maybe everyone had simply decided you were worse than you were. That was easier too. And then, Leon corrected you. You corrected me. She looked directly at him. You told me you knew the warehouse was unsafe. Marek nodded. I kept wanting to decide what that made you. Monster, coward, criminal, penitent man with a tragic scar. Pick a category and finish the sketch. And now Laurel took a breath. Now I think knowing you is going to require that I keep asking. The answer stayed between them until Marek said, I want that. Laurel looked at him. He rarely let his sentences carry extra feeling, so the one that followed landed harder. Most people near me are there for a reason I understand. Fear, loyalty, debt, money, family obligation. Sometimes ambition. He looked toward their reflected faces in the dark glass. I know how those relationships work. Laurel waited rather than explain him to herself. Marek continued. You sat beside me before you knew enough to fear me properly. Then you learned enough that leaving would have been reasonable. His gaze returned to hers. You kept choosing to speak to me anyway. Not because you think I am innocent. I know that now. Laurel's throat tightened. Good. I don't want you beside me because you have decided I deserve redemption. Also good. I want you beside me because when you don't understand something anymore, you ask. Laurel looked down at his hand, resting between them. The first night. That same hand had held a paperback, while 3 men went pale in the aisle. She remembered wondering what old damage on his knuckles meant. For once, she did not need to. Laurel placed her hand over his. Marek looked down, then at here. Don't make this dramatic, she said. You sat beside me on a train everyone assumed would turn into a crime scene. Nobody thought that. You did. I thought there might be stabbing. That is a crime scene. Laurel laughed. You have been overselling that moment ever since. He turned his hand beneath hers and laced their fingers together. A teenager nearby continued watching a video without headphones. Someone behind them complained about tomorrow's weather. A conductor moved through the aisle, checking tickets. The ordinary noise of strangers filled every space silence had occupied months before. They reached Laurel's station after midnight. Marek got off with her, even though his stop was farther north. She noticed and asked, You know you're on the wrong platform now. I am aware. There is another train in 40 minutes. I am also aware. They walked beneath the station lights toward the parking area where Laurel's mother's old car waited. She stopped before reaching it. You missed your stop for this. No. Marek looked toward the tracks behind them. I chose to get off. Laurel smiled. That was almost romantic. Almost. You still sound like you're filing a report. He stepped closer. Not close enough to make the decision for her. Laurel looked at his face. At the scar she no longer needed to interpret, and closed the remaining distance herself. The kiss was quiet and brief at first. Marek's hand came to her waist when she stayed close, and Laurel kissed him again because no one there was watching for proof. And neither of them needed the moment to prove anything. When they separated, Marek rested his forehead lightly against hers. Laurel said, You're going to miss your next train too. Probably. Reckless. I have a history. Bad joke. Yes. She smiled anyway. The first night, Laurel Quinn sat beside Marek Varga. Silence had moved through the train because a handful of frightened men recognized him, and everyone else followed their fear. Laurel had done something similar afterward. She had gathered the scar, the articles, the dead workers, his restraint, his guilt, and his reputation. Then tried to decide what kind of man those facts created. Months later, the train had been loud with tired commuters. Phone calls, breaks, arguments, laughter, and ordinary life. People still recognized Marek. Some still feared him. The legal consequences of what he had done were not finished, and Laurel did not know what the final judgment would be. She preferred it that way. This time, nobody in the carriage decided for her who Marek Varga was, and neither had she.